Welcome, and thank you very much to the Guild for providing me with the opportunity to speak to you today about George Thomson of Huddersfield, whom I've dubbed the Ruskinian Industrialist. On the left you can see the handsomely produced pamphlet on which this talk is based, published by the Guild, and on the right a long forgotten sketch of Thomson published in the socialist newspaper The Clarion in about 1892, and that gives you a bit of a clue as to who we're looking at here. He was a liberal, but he regarded himself as a practical socialist, and in many ways his life was a clarion call to the rest of us to incorporate Ruskinian principles into our lives and into everything we do. The video of me has disappeared so that we can focus instead on the slides, and I'll answer the question of why we should be interested in George Thomson. And the first thing to say is that he was one of the few men of business who put Ruskin's ideas into practice. He turned his father's commercial woollen mill into a successful profit-sharing co-partnership, supplying high-quality goods to the cooperative movement. He won the loyalty of his workers and customers alike. A liberal town councillor, he cared passionately about education and the arts. He became the mayor of Huddersfield and was rewarded with the freedom of the city. And he was an early companion of the Guild of St. George, who rose from junior to senior trustee to become our third master. These are all things which I'll try and unpack in the next few minutes. Let's start with some basic biographical facts, which I've included at the bottom of the slide. He was born in Huddersfield in 1842 and died there in 1921. His father, William Thomson, who, as I said, began the commercial woolen mill, was from Scotland, precisely where we don't know. George married, but quite late, in his 40s, and tragically his wife died young in 1900. They had 6 children together, 5 of whom survived into adulthood, all of them daughters. On the left-hand side you can see Bramham College near Leeds, which is one of 2 educational establishments that Thomson attended, the other being John Tattersfield's Academy in Huddersfield. And on the right is Woodhouse Hall in the district of Fartown, which George would represent when he was a councillor. And this house, which unfortunately has been demolished, became the site of many celebrations for family, for business, and indeed the Liberal Association over the years. The first thing to say is that it was George's father, William Thomson, who established a successful commercial woolen mill. William Thomson and Sons, founded as a woolen merchant in 1842. They began manufacturing wool in the 1850s, and George joined the firm as a rather reluctant 16-year-old, full of dreams but willing to learn the ropes, in 1859. There were a series of short-lived commercial partnerships in the 1870s, but ultimately they carried on their own, and in 1871 they were employing 90 men. They were based at that time in Priestroyd mills on Firth Street, which you can see in a rather more sorry state in recent years. But it was with the death of William Thomson in 1878, when the firm fell into George's hands, that a new era began. One of the first things that Thomson wanted to do was to get out into fresher air, and so he removed the mill to Dayton, on the edge of Huddersfield, on what is now the Leeds Road, and on the Huddersfield Broad Canal. Unfortunately, there don't appear to be any surviving images of the mill at all. If anybody knows any better, I'd certainly be interested to hear. I'd love to know what the place looked like. What you can see on the left hand side is a photograph I took a number of years ago, looking from the site of Woodhouse Mill across the canal and the Leeds Road to Dayton Mill, which stood diagonally opposite. And on the right hand side you can see Woodhouse Mill is now a nature reserve, which one might think is not an inappropriate use for a great Ruskinian industrial experiment. And at the bottom is what we might think of as a sort of logo of the company, as it really made changes in 1886, and that's going to be our focus. Although we don't have any photographs of the outside of the buildings, we do have a couple inside in the 1890s showing steam weaving and steam spinning at Woodhouse Mills. Now you may ask yourself, what is a Ruskinian business doing using steam? So let's turn to what George Thomson thought of Ruskin. Thomson was unambiguous in calling himself a disciple of the great master. Started reading Ruskin in the 1860s. He became a particular devotee of Time and Tide and Fors Clavigera, and it was from that reading that he accepted Ruskin's analysis of competitive business as corrupt, unjust and dishonest. He believed, as Ruskin did, that both employer and employed had become demoralized and degraded, and Thomson wanted to tackle this head on. Thomson would do that by means of a Ruskinian industrial experiment with his own family's woolen mill. What did he think that entailed? Improved working conditions, which he interpreted as more spacious, more attractive and healthier working premises. It meant respect for the dignity of labour, which entailed just terms of employment and bringing carding, dyeing and finishing under one roof so that workers would have a sense of the whole product that they were making. And it meant honesty in exchange, which implied fair prices and also purity of product. So what are the key features of this profit-sharing co-partnership from 1886, whose motto was truth in industry? Well, the first thing is, I think we can think of it as a John Lewis style mutual, though the particular features were that all workers were unionised. They were all paid a fixed wage, which was set slightly above the local union average. All workers were entitled to shares after 6 months of employment, and all shareholders were entitled to a share in the profits by means of dividends. And the main customer for its products were the cooperative wholesale societies. As a co-partnership, the management of the company was vested in a committee which consisted of George Thomson, who you can see dead centre there in his rather grainy photograph of the committee from the 1890s. But also on that committee were at least a couple of representatives of the cooperative shareholders, a couple of representatives of the trade unions, and a majority on the committee, at least 3 members, were workers in the mills themselves. Thomson evidently wrote to Mrs. Seven to tell her something of what had been happening at the woolen mill. Exactly how much detail he went into we don't know, but it was enough for Ruskin to write to him to say, "I cannot enough thank you or express the depth of my pleasure in the announcement made in your letter to Mrs. Seven of the momentous and absolutely foundational step taken by you in all that is just and wise in the establishment of these relations with your workmen. Clearly, this is a crucial endorsement from Ruskin. It meant a great deal to George Thomson personally, and indeed to William Thomson and Sons Limited as a company. And it was often quoted on brochures, not always accurately, but certainly in the exact spirit of Ruskin's approval. And I think it tells us something about Ruskin's own sense of pragmatism, about what could realistically be done at this point in British industrial and economic development. Both here and on the next slide, I've included a couple of adverts from the 1890s, and I think what they really demonstrate is the pride that Thomson felt in the method of production and the quality of the work, but also in the endorsement that he received from people he respected. In this case, and it may not be very easy to read, George Jacob Holyoake, one of the great architects of the cooperative movement, somebody who was known to Ruskin and who deeply admired Ruskin himself. And on this slide, I suppose we're really seeing how proud they were of the different prizes that they won in competitions for the quality of their work. And in a sense, this is symbolized by the trademark, which they had to develop because so many companies were trying to pass off their shoddy goods as a product of Thomson's. The remarkable success of William Thomson and Sons Limited was in winning the loyal support of the workers. And in order to understand that, we need to look at some of the key developments in the firm over the years. It's worth saying that even before it became a profit-sharing co-partnership, from 1883, there was a non-compulsory sickness benefit scheme and a pension fund. The difference from 1886 was that these benefits were defined, guaranteed and non-contributory. There was sickness pay, there was accident convalescent pay, and there was a pension. In 1891, an 8-hour working day was introduced with a half-hour break for breakfast and a 45-minute break for lunch. And in 1894, a beautiful cottage with a splendid garden opened with free reading and dining rooms and conversation rooms and, yes, politically incorrect now, a smoking room. In the first decade of the 20th century, a women's guild or social club was introduced, and also a marriage portion. Thomson's would only employ single women, but when they got married and had to leave their jobs, there was compensation in the form of £5 or £10 depending on how long they'd worked there. This is something which we might come back to. In 1910, long before it became a right in the rest of the British economy, a compulsory annual week's holiday was introduced. I've already said that women were not employed when they were married, and they didn't employ children either. The upshot was that in all the time that Thomson was head of the firm, there were no strikes. This was a period of persistent and considerable industrial action, both in the area and nationally. I've recorded very briefly here some of the major roles that Thomson took up in the public life of Huddersfield, and you can read them for yourself, but what emerges from it is the extent to which he was involved in education and the arts. And one of the things he did in supporting the Municipal Art Gallery and being president of the Huddersfield Art Society was to bring exhibitions of works from the Ruskin collection to Huddersfield, and there were several very successful examples of that, and that takes us on to his role in the Guild of St George. Thomson took an increasingly active role in the Guild. He became a companion under Ruskin in 1876 and accepted Ruskin's invitation to become the junior trustee of the Guild in 1884. In 1889 he became one of the two Guild representatives to the Ruskin Museum Committee run by Sheffield Corporation, and you can see the Ruskin Museum at Meersbrook Hall on the right of the screen. When Baker became master in 1900, Thomson stepped into his shoes and became senior trustee, and then when Baker died in 1910, Thomson became the third master of the Guild. He was disappointing as master. He was very busy as a public representative in Huddersfield. Ruskin's reputation was on the decline in this period. There was the disruption of the First World War, and Thomson's health was deteriorating, and so it was really a fairly inactive period in the history of the organisation. As I draw to a close, on the right you can see 9 Regent Road in Egerton, at least as it looked a couple of years ago. And this was Thomson's final home, where he died 100 years ago last month. And then there's a rather grainy image from a newspaper of him in his final years when he was master of the Guild. And I think the reason we want to look back to Thomson and should feel inspired by him as we face our own challenges in the 21st century is that he was a principled man. He was bold in his industrial experiment and indeed his public life. He was very determined and stuck with it. He was intelligent in thinking through those principles and how they could be applied. He cared deeply about people and about their lives and how things were made and how ethical principles were upheld in the practice of our lives. And in that sense, he was a deeply practical man of vision. Now, if we had a few more people like that, then perhaps we would be in a better place to tackle the challenges that we face. And if you ask me why should you buy the pamphlet, well, apart from the fact that of course I've gone into much more detail there, I think the one thing that really is valuable about it is that I've quoted extensively from Thomson himself in the many interviews he gave to newspapers. And so to read him in his own words, to understand his motivations and what he was trying to do, I think that is where we can really learn something about somebody who I think does deserve to be thought of as one of the very few Ruskinian industrialists. I pop up at the end because I'm sure the question you're asking is, how successful was William Thomson and Sons as a company? And of course that depends on how you define success. I mean, in purely capitalist terms, it didn't make the kind of money that other ruthless competitive businesses did, and that means that it required a great deal of sacrifice on the part of Thomson himself, which makes me admire him all the more. And I think if others were to put to the forefront of their consideration the welfare of the workforce, the quality of the products being made, the fairness on which those products are offered to customers and so on, we would be living in an infinitely more decent society. The pamphlet is dedicated to Dr. Mark Frost, who we welcome as a director today. He has, as you will know, done a great deal of work on the early history of the Guild, on early companions, and I know that he shares much of my enthusiasm for Thomson. So in thanking the Guild, may I just quickly plug something of my own, which is my Ruskin research blog. There are 21 entries and you can find it at www.stuarteagles.co.uk/blog. I hope you'll find some interesting things there, and as always, your feedback is very much welcome. Thank you for watching.